Now this is J.M.W.'s Turner's self-portrait. After he'd been accepted, well, he'd become a full member of the Royal Society at age, like, I think 17. He was admitted to the Royal Society at 14, which gives you some idea of what an incredible prodigy this man was. But here he's done a portrait, which is really, it's not an honest portrait. He's a very honest painter, but this is not an honest portrait. And he knew it wasn't an honest portrait. He had a very low sense of his low self-esteem when it came to his appearance. And so he picked the best view he could of himself, and then he embroidered it a bit. But he had a very troubled childhood, and which didn't help his self-esteem. And this is how more of this caricature of him is more of a likeness. He was a little man who actually was quite ugly according to most people. And he was described by Delacroix, who met him. They didn't hit it off. He said he had the look of an English farmer, black clothes, gross enough, big shoes, and a hard, cold demeanor. In fact, he wasn't a hard, cold person at all, but he was very, very reserved and defensive and secretive. He lived, in fact, a double life. There was a whole side to him, his life and his personality, which most people never saw. He was born in this house. His father was a wig maker. And of course, being a wig maker meant that he came in, even though it was a fairly humble trade, he came in contact with a lot of very wealthy people, which was going to end up being to Turner's benefit. But his wife, they had another child, and that the daughter who died at 7. And his wife went mad shortly after the daughter's death. Her grief was so great that she just went completely mad. And she went into these terrifying rages and got apparently quite violent. And eventually, Turner's father committed her to an asylum, which in those days was not somewhere you would want to go. I think he did it out of desperation, but it was a terrible thing to have to do. Because of these rages, because of all the trouble in the house, at age 11, Turner was farmed out to his maternal uncle, who was a butcher. And having experienced such terrible things at home, he took to painting, drawing and painting. And once he discovered an interest in it, it became his entire life. And he concentrated on nothing else. When people asked him what the secret to his genius was, he said, "The secret to my genius is hard work." He did nothing but draw and paint for the rest of his life. He discovered very early how to make money doing this, because he was a very good draftsman, and he started drawing for architects, and he started also doing landscapes. And he discovered a market for it very early on. His first drawings were actually shown in his father's wig shop in the window, which would have been down probably on the ground floor here. And so right from the beginning, he was making money, and he was tight-fisted and very, very good at business, quite unlike many artists. This is an example of his early work, the kind of thing that he could sell. And he would travel all around England doing landscapes and doing paintings of people's houses. This is actually King's College in Cambridge. The head of the Royal Society was founded by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And so it was very new in England. It was founded, excuse the equal sign there. It was founded about 10 years before Turner was born, I believe. Joshua Reynolds became aware of Turner and encouraged him to join, and encouraged his fellow members of the Royal Society to accept Turner at the age of 14, which also meant that Turner now had official recognition of his talent, and it made it easier for him to sell his work. And in fact, by this time, he was receiving more orders for watercolors than he could possibly fulfill. But Joshua Reynolds actually died a few years after Turner was accepted at the Royal Academy, but Turner always remembered him and asked to be buried next to him. Another example of his early landscape watercolors, incredibly accomplished. And what you can see here is his mastery of perspective was spectacular. And in fact, he becomes master of perspective at the Royal Society. So this was one of his earlier and highly successful watercolors, which led to huge numbers of commissions. It's Norham Castle, and he did this particular one in 1797 when he was 22. He did another one a few years later. This is interesting because he returns to this subject over and over again his whole life. So you can see some of his evolution just in these paintings. This is later, and you can see what's happening is the castle is becoming less important and the treatment of light and space is becoming more important. And finally, much later in his life, actually just 6 years before his death, this one, where really morning light has become the subject. But going back a bit in his life, this was his first oil painting at age 21. And it already shows a complete mastery of oils and also a mastery of marine subjects, which will become one of, and a very unusual lighting, moonlighting. It prefigures a lot of his later work in a certain way.
What are those palette colors there, Anthony? Would you say?
Well, I'm not, I was asked about his palette in the last presentation on this. I'm gonna look up and see if I can find his palette, but I suspect I won't be able to because he was one of these people who used every color who came on the market indiscriminately. Including ones which were fugitive, which has led to a lot of his paintings changing considerably. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But it's quite a limited palette and a real chiaroscuro, exercise in chiaroscuro. This is a later seascape. This was painted after his first journey you know, English painters during this period couldn't go to Europe because of the Napoleonic Wars. In 1801, there was a momentary truce, and everyone, all English artists, rushed to Europe, financed by their wealthy patrons, Turner among them. And these are boats docking at Calais. And this is his memory of that experience. It's a stunning painting. And already you see his utter fascination with wind and water and the elements in general. Now, while he was in Paris, we happen to know that the gentleman who was escorting him, mostly what Turner did when he got to Paris was he went and explored the Alps. He spent most of his time there in the Alps walking. One of the things Turner would do is he would walk for days and weeks at a time, sketching the whole time and gathering information which he'd bring back to his studio. But this is probably, we're not quite sure, but is probably evidence of his visit to a brothel in Paris, as is this. This is probably his first love, who was a widow. He'd known her when she was married. He knew her husband, a very talented musician. And they took up shortly after the death of her husband. And in fact, Turner's two major relationships were both with widows, which, well, it has a significance. While he was in Paris, he saw Titian, and this was his paying his respects to Titian and that school of painting. Like all the Romantics, he preferred Titian, Rubens, Rembrandt to the more classical painters because he was interested in color. He was interested in brushwork. In this way, he was very similar to Delacroix. But the thing you can see here, looking at it, the figures are quite well done, but they're not as polished or as competent as the figures of artists who focused on the figure, the work of Delacroix, for instance, or Goya. And in fact, he would not focus on the figure that much throughout his whole life. And it's probably because in his escape from his family life into art, he also escaped from personal relationships because he became and remained an incredibly private person. He had a number of patrons. This was his leading patron, who is a character. Lord Egremont. See if I can find some of my notes on Egremont, because he was fabulously wealthy. He was an agriculturalist. He was up with all the most recent methods of agriculture. He built canals throughout England. He was incredibly generous, hospitable, blunt, and eccentric. He had 15 mistresses and 40 children, many of whom lived in this huge house with him and were constantly fighting. Crazy. But,
oh my God, that sounds so stressful.
And this is his house, one of his many properties. He had castles as well. Petworth in the distance here. Turner, like many of these wealthy landed gentry, they entertained artists. In fact, they would have artists come and stay with them. Turner had an open invitation to come and stay here anytime he wanted, as long as he wanted. And he painted here. Apart from painting here and just hanging out in this crazy scene, he would fish, because that was his favorite pastime besides painting, was fishing. And you see he had a good place to fish right here. This lake near the house was connected by a canal to other waterways, a canal which Egremont had built. This was the library in Petworth, and Turner was allowed to use it as his studio whenever he was there. And this is one of his views of the interior of Petworth, done many years later than the period we're talking about right now. But a spectacular interior. It's hard to know what's going on here. All you can see is one little dog. Who knows what else is happening? Maybe it's after the various mistresses that had a big fight and left a mess in one of the big rooms. I don't know. But it's a brilliant piece of painting, though. Very late in his career. While he was at Petworth one day, Egremont said to him, Turner, why don't you do me a painting that expresses the massiveness of our warships? So Turner said, okay. And he took one of Egremont's children with him. And the son in later years told the story of watching Turner paint this. He said, well, Turner just put water all over the paper, and then he threw paint at it. And then he started pushing this wet paint around. And then as it dried a little, he worked into it. This was the result. This came out of Turner's head over a few hours. He was born near the Thames, and he always lived near the Thames, and he was most comfortable on the water, hanging out with sailors. He never lost his Cockney accent, and he was very uncomfortable in polite company. This was one of Egremont's canals, and he did this painting for Egremont. Okay, 1812. Turner, like the other Romantics, would saw the world in terms of classical history. And a piece of history that he was fascinated with, and we're going to come back to it several times, was the struggle between Rome and Carthage. For a while, Carthage threatened the very existence of Rome. When Hannibal, with his army, surprised Italy by coming over the Alps in the winter. But Hannibal lost half his army in the Alps. And what this down in the right-hand corner is Hannibal's army being obviously, suffering great cold and these terrible blizzards. Up here, brigands who've raided his army and taken captives and are busy plundering. Why did he paint this? He painted this because at this very moment, Napoleon was losing his army in Russia. So this was his way of reacting to that knowledge in the Russian winter. But Carthage held a even larger fascination for him because of the story of Dido, the founder of Carthage. At least legend has it that Dido founded it. Carthage was founded by the Phoenicians, who were an Eastern seafaring civilization, and Carthage became incredibly powerful and controlled the Western Mediterranean, which was something that Rome could not stand. But here, Dido is founding Carthage. It's a really quite beautiful painting, and it bears a lot of, how can I put it? It reflects on Turner's incredible respect for Claude Lorraine, the French painter Claude Lorraine, who he's trying to emulate here. But what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting about it is he hadn't been, at this point when he painted this, he hadn't been to Italy. And if you look at the landscape, it looks very English, the trees in particular. He's making this all up without ever having been to the Latin world or the Mediterranean. But there's another aspect to Dido's story. I don't know how many of you know this, because the legend has it that Aeneas founded Rome. Aeneas was a survivor of Troy, the destruction of Troy. He escapes Troy with his father and family and sails out into the Mediterranean and has all these adventures. But his fate is to eventually found Rome. But on the way, he stops, actually after his father's died, he stops in Carthage and meets Dido, and the two of them fall in love, which creates a problem because he can't stay in Carthage. He has to go on to found Rome, according to the story. So here is the people of Carthage with Dido, and I don't know where they are, but Dido and Aeneas is supposed to be here somewhere, probably here. And they're walking out to visit the grave of Dido's husband. And Dido hopes that this will put an end to the budding romance, because neither of them want to have a romance. They both have their own destinies. Of course, it doesn't work out that way. They have a romance, and then finally, Aeneas abandons Dido to follow his fate, and she commits suicide. Well, what is the significance of this story? Well, there's several significances. First of all, Aeneas is famous for his love of and his loyalty to his father. He carries Anchises, his father, out of Troy, burning Troy, on his shoulders. He takes him in the boat, and he's absolutely distraught when his father dies. So there's that aspect, the destroyed homeland, and then just being alone with his father. Then the other aspect is when Aeneas gets to Carthage, he falls in love with a widow. And that's exactly what happens to Turner. So there are a number of ways in which this story has a very personal significance for Turner. Okay, this is a rival of Turner's who did these kind of famous for these kind of scenes. And this particular painting is pensioners from the military who are celebrating the fact they've just learned of the victory over Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. And it's a very joyful, celebratory painting, which was one of his most famous paintings, actually. This was Turner's response. This is the battlefield of Waterloo at night after the battle. Now, that battle involved over 170,000 troops, of which, 180,000 troops, of which 70,000 died. It was a bloodbath. And Turner's response is to paint the night after the battle when the women are coming into the field to try and find their husbands and lovers among the dead. He did this, he actually went to, because now that Napoleon was defeated, he was able to go back to Europe for an extended journey, and he spent time studying the field of Waterloo, doing hundreds of sketches and interviewing people. But this is Turner was had a very dark view of the human fate and human history, much like Goya in that way. But here he is back. This is a result of that return journey to Europe, where he could travel much further. And he actually went to Italy on this journey. And this is Dordrecht in the Netherlands, and incredibly successful and beautiful painting, done entirely from notes that he took, sketches that he took on his travels. Because all he did when he traveled was sketch and watercolors and sketch and watercolors wherever he went. Even apparently when he was traveling in carriages, he would be looking out the window doing little sketches that no one could figure out what they were about. But they were notes that he could use to remind himself of what he'd seen. He had an incredible visual memory. But look at the water and the sky in this, done from his memory or his imagination. This is around the time that his father dies, and I don't know much. It's Alnwick Castle in England, and I don't know very much about it. It's a moonscape. It's a really beautiful painting, though, and it has a kind of melancholy. He was devastated by his father's death. And in fact, this painting, again, this is about Aeneas. Aeneas finally reaches the coast of Italy around Naples, and he wants to visit his father in the underworld, and the entrance to the underworld was traditionally around Naples because of the volcano there. And he visits the command Sibyl, who tells him that he will have to find a golden bough. You have to go into the forest and find a golden bough. And with that, and bring that to her, and then he'll be allowed to enter the underworld. So in this picture, the underworld is down here. It's a crater of a volcano. And what looks like mist is actually poisonous gas. This is the Sibyl.
What's on the left, like the Egyptian or something, or on the far left?
These would be, no, they would be paintings that at the time, actually, they'd found, I'm not sure if, they found old Roman and Greek paintings.
Right.
That were, they had these architectural decorative paintings that they did. And this is an example of one. This is the Sibyl here, holding up the golden bough. These are the Fates dancing before the entrance to the underworld. Over here is a serpent representing death and the underworld. But also look at the landscape. At this point, Turner has been to Naples. And his landscape begins to actually reflect Mediterranean landscape. Okay, back in England, a major historic event, which of course he had to record. And he did dozens of watercolors. The Houses of Parliament burning. The Houses of Parliament burned for a couple of days, actually. And every time a timber from the ceiling fell, the whole of London, which was watching this spectacle, would applaud. It was really exciting to Londoners to see the Parliament burn. It's interesting. It's an interesting historical fact how it started, on what started it. In those days, they kept records of debts. And, you know, they're records of all their financial records were the thing that was the evidence of the debt you held was half of a piece of wood that was split in two, just physically torn apart. And both pieces of wood had recorded on them the information. And the way you could prove you were the owner was to bring the two pieces of wood together. They stored all these bits of wood next to the furnace. in the House of Commons, in the Parliament building, finally caught on fire. So he did all these watercolors, and then he did 2 magnificent paintings. You can see the whole of London gathered, watching the burning of the Parliament. And you can see as he progresses, his painting becomes less and less about physical detail and more about these elemental forces. This is one that I love a lot. It's ships provisioning the fleet with coal. These are called keelmen, these little ships that have the fires to light their way, the braziers, and they're loading coal onto the big ships. But the handling of light in the sky, in the water, is just spectacular. This is something he would have been familiar with from his childhood, because the Thames was filled with this shipping at this time. But mythology continues to engross him a lot of the time. This is the myth of Hero and Leander. I don't know if anyone knows it, but Hero was a priestess, a Greek priestess, and Leander became her lover, and he had to swim across this strait to reach her. And to guide him, she would hold up a light. Well, one night a huge storm came in and blew out the light. He lost his way swimming, and she witnessed him drowning. Then she threw herself into the water. Of course, it's another one of these wonderful romantic stories. But this is a magnificent evocation of it. The priestess's temple up here she is, and he's somewhere down in the water here. I think this may be him here, actually drowning. And these are wraiths from the underworld come to gather him and take him to the underworld. Around this time, he met a woman who originally, Sophia Carolyn Booth. The time he first met her, actually, she was married, and he got to know her husband, and her husband had been a captain and told him stories of the slave trade, which left a very strong impression. This is a drawing made later when, after her husband died, he started a relationship with her. And in fact, they had a relationship for the rest of his life. In later years, he would move her to another house a little house on the Thames, where he would live with her under an assumed identity, he was known as Puggy Booth or Admiral Booth. And none of the people in her circle, or the circle of people around, knew that he was J.M.W. Turner. They had no idea. He felt the sense is that he was much more relaxed in this working class environment than he ever was in the upper class world of the Royal Academy, though he was incredibly loyal to the Royal Academy. It was his family. This is the painting that the British voted their most favorite painting. It's this big galleon that's being towed by the steamship here is the Fighting Temeraire, which was the ship on which Nelson died in the Battle of Trafalgar. And this is the moment at which it is being towed, decommissioned. It is being towed to be broken up, and it's being towed by an early steamship. one of the things about Turner is he was not nostalgic for the past at all. He was a city boy, and he, even though he lived on the Thames and was caught up in everything around the sea, he was interested in every new invention and development. And but he saw that, he realized the significance of this moment. It was the beginning of the end of age of sail and the beginning of the age of steam. Now, one of the interesting things about this painting is that, as far as scholars can tell, he wasn't even in England when this happened. So this is entirely his invention. But it became the most, I mean, partly because of England's history, it's become the most popular painting in England. But as I mentioned before, he learned from Sophia Booth's husband about some of the slave trade and about the practice of, if there was a major storm and slaves died on board ship, they couldn't collect insurance for them. But if they were lost at sea, they could collect insurance. Mm-hmm. So when a major storm appeared, they would throw the sick, the dead, or the dying overboard. And that's what's going on in this painting. Mm-hmm. You can see, I mean, it's pretty grisly, actually. There's a leg here, and there are fish obviously feeding on the body of this, and there are hands reaching out of the water here. One of his most famous paintings, the poet, the critic Ruskin, who would champion him in his later years, bought this painting, but he finally sold it. He said he couldn't bear, as great a painting as it was, he couldn't bear to have it hanging on his wall. Mm. Now you remember Wilkie, his rival, who did the painting with all the figures in it, celebrating the Battle of Waterloo. Wilkie later went to Africa, and on the way back he died, and he was buried at sea. And this is Turner's tribute to Wilkie, who was a friend as well as a rival, and a really very powerful painting. What's interesting is the sailing ship in this, which would have been, is accompanied by a steamship. So again, the moment when the two types of locomotion are present at the same time, are represented in his work. This is a storm in the Val d'Aosta, and it was one of the ways he went to Italy, and one of the routes that would eventually take him to Venice. Again, incredibly dramatic. Venice. Turner, well, the English in general were utterly enamored of Venice. At this point, Venice had lost his doge. It was no longer. It was now after the peace, after the end of hostilities. It became an Austrian possession. But Turner paints it at an earlier time, and in this case, he pays homage to Canaletto. That's Canaletto painting there. Can you see it?
Yes.
The figure with the canvas.
Mm-hmm.
He would have seen, the English were the big collectors of Canaletto. He would have seen huge, in the various wealthy homes that he was a guest at, he would have seen numerous Canalettos, and he admired him greatly. And a painting like this reflects that more than his later work. So he didn't spend a lot of time in Venice. He spent, I think I once figured out, he spent maybe 4 weeks in Venice over his whole career. but he did enormous numbers of sketches and watercolors, which he then used to create numerous oil paintings because his paintings of Venice were extremely popular. I think this is a lovely watercolor of San Giorgio Maggiore, looking at it actually from the customs house. Now, mostly he would do drawings on site and he'd do the watercolors at night from memory. I don't know if that's the case. This one sure looks like it was painted on site, but you don't know with him. But this is a wonderful, now this is the lagoon looking towards, he calls it Santo Campo, but it's the island, it's San Michele, Isola San Michele, where the dead were buried, which we saw, if you remember, we also saw it in one of Canaletto's paintings. I wonder, at this point, Byron was dead and Byron is buried here. And I wonder if that was on Turner's mind, because Turner, like Delacroix, did a lot of paintings based on Byron's work, inspired by Byron, basically. The story goes that he had himself tied to a mast to witness a snowstorm at sea.
Yes.
And this was the result. However, a lot of scholars have cast doubt on that story. At the time, he would have been 65, and there's no record of the boat he claimed to have been tied to the mast on. But nonetheless, an utterly brilliant evocation of a storm with the kind of spiraling. You can see that he's grasped and trying to convey to us the energy of nature and the spiraling of forces of water and air. Incredibly radical for his time and verging on abstract expressionism. He also had to celebrate the railroad. At this time, this was a time of, the 30s and 40s were a time when they were building railroads all over England, and the most famous of the engineers was Brunel. And this is his Great Western Railroad. And Brunel was this sort of heroic engineer who did tunnels and bridges, including one of the first suspension bridges, and also built this railroad. And it's called Rain, Steam, and Speed. And so not only is he a precursor here of abstract expressionists, but he's a precursor of the futurists, celebrating speed and motion and modern technology. The year before his death, he paints another picture of Dido and Aeneas going to visit the tomb of Dido's husband. This is Aeneas, this is Dido. These are the other Carthaginians here. And you wonder, I mean, why so close to his death? And it occurs to me that he was thinking about the fact that he would be deserting his lover because he knew he was near death. And let's see, there's so much to say about him that you can't, I do not remember to mention everything. But this is the last painting. So any comments, any questions?
Did he, Anthony, did he kind of have a sickness or something that he knew that he was near death or you know?
He was getting old and he was breaking down. And I mean, I don't know for sure, but he was in very bad shape towards the very end of his life.
Mm.
And another very interesting thing about him is something I didn't mention, I really should mention. Right from the beginning of his career, he was having engravings and etchings made based on his work, which were used for book illustrations. So he was famous throughout Europe. I mean, this is true now of several painters that we've looked at. Because paintings are collected by wealthy people, and they tend to stay in one place. But book illustrations go everywhere, and prints go everywhere. So, toward the middle of his life, he was making so much money off the reproductions of his work that he actually didn't need to sell it, and he was really tight with his money. He didn't need to sell any more paintings. He started buying back his paintings.
Nice.
And when people came to his gallery, he had his own private gallery, he would often refuse to sell them the paintings they wanted. And when he died, his will specified that all his work all the work he was holding should go to the nation, and a gallery should be built specifically for it. He left enough money for it. He also left enough money for a retirement home for old and ailing artists.
Nice.
Oh.
Wow.
But none of that. But his relatives stepped in because there was some little weakness in the will. They were able to step in and fight over his money till it was all gone.
Mm.
In
Sounds like
court
a lot
costs
of-
mostly.